Okay, we're going to continue on in our study in the book of Hebrews, and we're going to pick it up in chapter 11. We've been in chapter 11, which is the faith chapter, and we've been reading about so many of these great people that exhibited their faith by obedience and by trusting God and by looking forward. Last week we talked about Abraham, who is considered the father of the faithful. Tonight we're going to begin talking about Moses. And these are again, I call them the heavy hitters. These are the patriarchs. And interesting, like up to this point, everything, all this stuff we've been talking about here, all these people, is all before the giving of the law. There was no law. There was no Torah given. There was just some basic, God gave Noah a few instructions about eating things with blood and so forth, and but there was no law. It's all been faith. We're going to see now when Moses comes on. We know that it was through Moses that the law came, but it's not even mentioned here in this chapter. And the reason is, we've said this before, that this letter is being written to people. Paul, I believe, wrote this letter to people who, and he's trying to convince them that the old ways were no longer necessary. Now, there are a lot of Jewish Christians who still celebrate the feast days. We're coming up here in just next week is the Feast of Trumpets. I think it's the 25th and the 26th. 10 days after that will be the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. At this point right now, there's like a 40-day period of repentance. The days between the Feast of Trumpets and Yom Kippur are called the days of awe, and it's the days when they would examine themselves and look at themselves closely. And a lot of the even Messianic Jews, recognize these holidays. They were raised with that, and all these holidays speak of Jesus. And there's nothing wrong, with them doing that, but there's something wrong if they feel they have to. And that's what this letter is all about. It's written to people that were raised with this. And if you're raised with customs, you're raised a certain way, it's kind of hard to break away from those customs, and that's understandable, especially when a lot of the customs were given to look forward to the coming of Christ. So there are those who will recognize these days, but I always think, the Day of Atonement was the day once a year when the high priest would go in, and he talked about this earlier in this letter. He would go into the holy place and with the offering of blood. My high priest has gone into the holy place once for all. He's not in the holy place that are tents and made by the hands of men, but he's in the real holy place, and he's seated there. He doesn't have to come and go once a year over and over and over again. He went in there once for all. So every day is my Day of Atonement. I can go boldly to the throne of grace. The Passover that is celebrated. Every day we celebrate the blood of Jesus. Every day I'm under the blood. Not just once a year. If people choose to take that time of year and celebrate and thank God for that, that's okay, as long as they don't feel they have to, because there's many people feel they're compelled to, But the writer here he's trying to let these folks know, these Jewish Christians, the Christians in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, he's trying to let them know that it's a new covenant now. It's a new way now. It's a different way, where Jeremiah said, no longer we spoke about this Sunday, no longer is it written on stone, but now the law is written in your heart. There will come a time and I'll give you a new covenant. I'll make a new covenant with you, and I'll put my laws inside of you. So he's writing this to convince the people, the readers, that salvation is by faith. And he's bringing all these examples, and he comes now to Moses. And we're starting before we do that, I think it would be good for us to turn all the way back to Exodus, just so we can get like a kind of an idea of what he's talking about there. In Exodus chapter 2, now you all know the story, you should know the story that at the end of Genesis, if it gets a little cold in here, I do have the air running, and feel free to. Is anybody cold? Is everybody all right? Okay. We'll take a vote. Okay, it's all right. Everybody's all right. Okay, good. We'll leave it as it is. You can leave it as it is, Miss Lil. Nobody's complaining. If somebody starts complaining, you can leave it. You can leave it where it's at, Lil. You don't have to change. Nobody, unless you're complaining. If you're cold, you can change it. Are you cold? Okay. Okay, you say you're cool. She said, I'm cool, but okay. But if somebody gets cold, tell Miss Lil is the temperature person. Okay, she's our temperature minister. All right. But we all know the story about when at the end of Genesis, Joseph was made the second highest, most powerful man in the world, the second highest leader in Egypt. The Israelites they sent them to the land of Goshen. Jacob and his family. There was really virtually a handful of them at that time, and they were well favored because of Joseph. Well, Joseph died, and time went on, and all of a sudden the Jews, instead of being, or the Israelites, which is a more accurate name, instead of being looked upon as somebody favored, they were being looked upon as a potential enemy, and they became outcast in Egypt, and different pharaohs. There were different administrations that came along, and they became. One came along and said, "You know what? We need to do something about these Israelites, these Hebrews." So they made them slaves, and in chapter 2, it was to the point where Pharaoh saw that these Israelites were kept multiplying, like rabbits, right? I mean, it was like they kept having babies, and so Pharaoh said, "Well, that's So we see the first Planned Parenthood in the Bible, where he told all the midwives that if a young boy was to be born, then they were to kill it. They were to throw him in the river where the crocodiles would get him. If a young girl, it was all right, but they wanted to end the line. We talked about this, how Satan had tried to break the line that God had promised through which the Messiah would come. So interestingly, and this is just a little sidelight, in China, it's like the exact opposite. China, they've passed laws because they're so populous that families are only allowed to have one child. So with the advent of being able to tell whether you have a boy or girl, if it was a girl, they would have them aborted because the men would want their name to go on to a son, And so now, I read this a few years ago in China, there's like a woman shortage because over decades, it's like Planned Parenthood, right? Okay, but that's what was going on in Egypt, right? Pharaoh said, kill all the male boy, all the young baby boys, throw them in a river, and the girls, you're going to let them live, okay? So it says, that's kind of the setup in chapter 2, and we're just going to read a few verses, just so you get the idea of what we're going to read about in Hebrews. There went a man of the house of Levi and took a wife of the daughter of Levi. These are named Amram and Jochebed, we read elsewhere. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. She threw him in a river. She just gave him a little boat to be in. And his sister, who was Miriam, stood afar off to wit that to see what would happen. And don't you know, the daughter of Pharaoh. See, this is not a coincidence. Just like I met that gentleman up at the cancer center, that was no accident. We kind of struck up a relationship and made a connection. It was no accident that the daughter of Pharaoh just happened to go down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called Moses' mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee wages." So not only was her son saved, she got paid for raising him, right, for weaning him. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses, which means drawn. And she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now listen, here's this baby that was slated for death. Now he's become the son of Pharaoh's daughter, right? And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out into his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. Now this is many years later. Moses must have had a cognizance that he was a Hebrew, that he was one of the Jewish children. He saw one of the Egyptians smiting one of his brethren, the Hebrews. And he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand, thinking he was defending his country people. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you did that Egyptian? Oh man, Moses said, I'm found out. He thought he hit it pretty good. And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So we see this picture, this story, that Moses was raised by, he could have been the second most powerful man in all the world, because Pharaoh was a very powerful leader. And Moses had been adopted into the family. We don't know if there was any other family members or not. We don't know that. But it certainly is that Moses was in a very admirable place from a world standpoint. But he chose instead, and we're going to read this, he chose instead to identify not with Pharaoh, not with Pharaoh's daughter, who was his adopted mother, but with the people that were his people, okay? Just kind of a setup, so when we go back to Hebrews, we'll get a picture of what we're reading. Okay, back to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to start with verse 23. Now, this verse here isn't dealing with Moses. It's dealing with his parents. Because his parents had to have some faith. If you're going to stand up against the most powerful ruler in the world that hates you, that has threatened to kill you, that took some faith on the part of Amram and Jochebed, who were the parents of Moses. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, he didn't have anything to do with this. He was just a baby. He didn't have any faith. But his parents did. He was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. They weren't afraid. Why? Because they had faith. If you have faith in God, you don't have to be afraid of what they do in Washington, D.C. or Harrisburg or Greensburg. And believe me, there's forces in action to come against, to try to thwart the plan of God. And it's, if you think about it and you don't think about it in faith, you can get scared. But you don't have to be afraid of that. They weren't afraid of Pharaoh because they believed God. And listen, they didn't even have a clear idea of who God was. When you read this, and you read in Exodus, and you read the whole thing together, it had been 400 years since Joseph and the Hebrews came, and Jacob brought his family from the Promised Land to live in the land of Goshen. And over 400 years, they obviously had a history. They had a culture, customs that were passed down. There certainly were stories that were passed down, traditions and so forth. But they had not had a personal relation. They had not had a contact with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's almost like the 400 years of silence between Malachi and John the Baptist. Silence. They hadn't heard from God. They were desperate to hear from God because they were in bondage. But yet they still had faith. They still believed that there was something. They still had an idea that there was a God who, that they had heard about. There's another place, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. It says, they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments. Now we come to Moses. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Wow. He turned his back on the most powerful position, wealth. I mean, just imagine the Pharaoh. He had everything, man. He refused. He could have had the whole world. But he said, I don't want it. Instead, he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. He chose rather to take the side of his brothers, the Hebrews, the Israelites, than all the wealth in the world. What is it Jesus has said? Where your heart is, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Obviously, Moses didn't think much of the treasure of Egypt, and they had unspeakable wealth. But instead, he says, by faith. I mean, it took a lot of faith. You know, it takes faith to walk away from the things of the world, the nice things, the good things. Could you choose to reject living in the most palatial place with everything you need to identify yourself with slaves that were being beaten and mistreated? That takes some faith. That takes some faith. Sometimes we don't even have enough faith to turn the TV off. Okay. But Moses, man, he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for sin. Man, we could just float around there for the next 2.5 hours. Can you think of your own life where there were times when that sin, the pleasures of sin, man, sin, there's pleasure in sin. And nobody's saying amen, but you know what I'm talking about. I told my wife, you know, I'm all in favor of like medicinal marijuana. I'm all in favor because that's another medicine. If somebody needs to take a medicine, whatever. But I sure hope they don't make it legal for, you know, recreational purposes, huh? Because I don't have no trouble not drinking, but if that stuff gets legal, boy, you're going to have to pray for me. I used to like that. I'm telling you. Now, listen, I'm just being honest with you. I told my wife that. I'm just going to be transparent with you. Pleasure. Sin has pleasure. Sin feels good. You can make it work. You know, you can work it for money. I mean, if you know what you're doing, and if you're smart enough, you can keep from getting caught. But Moses, see, this is a choice that we have to make. This is a choice that we all have to make. Every day, multiple times a day. To suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Now listen, don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with enjoying life. You know, there's ways to enjoy life without sinning. But Moses chose. That took some faith. That took some faith. Listen, esteeming the reproach of Christ. Now Moses didn't know anything about the cross. I don't believe God gave him a clear vision of Jesus hanging on the cross, but the reproaches of the Anointed One, who would be rejected by the world. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Just like these other people we have read about and we have heard about, he looked beyond. He didn't just look at what was here, but he looked beyond. By faith, he looked past what he could see. He looked at the palace, looked at Pharaoh, looked at all the wealth, looked at all the riches, looked at everything that could be his. But he realized, just like when it said that Abraham looked for a city whose builder and maker was God, that's what Moses was looking for. He knew there was something better. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. He looked at what was coming instead of what was. Now listen, this is before, when Moses did that to that Egyptian, when he did that, it was before he knew anything about the promised land. It was before he knew anything about the commandments. It was before Sinai, before the Red Sea, before all that stuff. He didn't know that God had a place. He had heard of the God of Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they had been passed on, traditionally. But he did not have a clear understanding. This is why when he left, it says, by faith in verse 27, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He left because he knew there was something else. And we know that when he left, and again, if you go to Exodus and you read about when he left in chapter 2, he ended up in a place called Midian. He met a fellow there, became his shepherd, and for 40 years, we read that 40 years. It's like nothing, but 40 years. That's like 2/3 of my life. 40 years, that's a long time. For 40 years, he did nothing but keep them sheep. And then one day, there was a fire in a bush. I apologize, guys. I didn't get up. Let's turn there. Let's read this. Over in Exodus. Exodus chapter 3. Turn back here to Exodus. John, if you could get that up for me. I did not pull it up. But Exodus chapter 3. Check this out. And look what happened. I have to get an automatic page turner. Okay. In verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. Now this would be the place that he would receive. This is like Mount Sinai. But he didn't know anything about any law yet, right? And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses. And he said, here am I. Then thank the Lord. But keep all these guys saying, here am I. Abraham said it, and Jacob said it. They all said it. And he said, draw not nigh here, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place whereon you're standing is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Moses said, man, this is something here. And the Lord, that had been 400 years they hadn't heard anything like this. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. They didn't even know who they were crying to. But they were going to get ready to know who he was. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said, who am I? You're going to send me? That I should go unto Pharaoh? That I should bring forth the children out of Israel out of Egypt? Why are you picking me? And he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be a token unto thee, and I have sent thee. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. So God is saying, here, listen, Moses, here's your sign. You're going to come back to this place with the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. Okay? And Moses said unto God, behold, when I come to the children of Israel, what shall I say unto them? The God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say unto me, what's his name? Because they didn't know. 400 years, they didn't know who he was. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. This is why when Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, and he said, before Abraham was, I am, they wanted to stone him. Because Jesus said he's this God here that was in the burning bush. He's the God that called Moses to lead his people out of bondage. He says, thus shalt you say unto the children of Israel, I am has sent me. And God, moreover, God, and we'll just read a couple more verses. Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. And we all know how it is. He was to go to the elders, and Moses said, listen, I'm not a good speaker. I stutter. I can't talk. And he tried to get out of it, and God said, well, I'll send your brother Aaron, and he'll be your mouthpiece and so forth. And we know what happened. Moses went back to Egypt. God gave him that staff, that turned into a serpent, right? And he gave him that, and he said, go. And he went back, and he went to Pharaoh. He said, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, who do you think you are? And he made the people work harder. He said they must be too busy. They must not be busy enough. They must have too much time on their hands, right? So he made them work harder. So that did not make Moses very popular with the people of Israel. So he went back, and 11 times he went back, and God sent the plagues and so forth. And we all know about that. But it's the 12th plague. When we go back to Hebrews, it's the 12th plague. Because it says this, going back to Hebrews chapter 11. And verse 28. Through faith, he what? Kept the Passover. This is the first Passover. We all know that God kept sending plagues, and Pharaoh kept hardening his heart. God said, I'm going to send one more plague. You can read about this in Exodus chapter 12. We're not going to turn there. You can read about it. God said, I'm going to send one more plague. I'm going to send the death angel. See, up to that point, it was flies and frogs and, whatever else. But now, he's going to send the big one. And he told Moses, he says, here's what you're going to do. He says, this day is going to be like the beginning of your year, because it's like the birth of a nation. He says, I want you to take a lamb, and he gave him some very specific details. Take a lamb and slay it. Take the blood, put it on the lintels and the doorpost of every house. And there was one lamb for so many people. There was, very detailed instructions. And God said, when you go in the evening to eat that lamb, make sure you're dressed and ready to go, because in the morning you're going to be moving. So, Moses told the people, take the blood and put it on. I'm sure the people said, what are we doing this for? What's this all about? And take blood and put it on the doorpost? I'm just going to have to paint over it again. But whoever was in that house under the blood escaped the death angel. When the death angel came through, the firstborn of everything was taken. Animals, people. Pharaoh bewailed the fact that he lost his firstborn son, was taken by the death angel. And anyone who was under the blood, Jew or Gentile, Israelite or Egyptian, didn't matter. Whoever was under the blood was saved. God said, do this every year. I want you to remember the Passover. By faith, Moses kept the Passover. It might not have made a lot of sense to him, but he was obedient, and he did what God told him to do. The next, in verse 29, it says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land. When Pharaoh let them go, and they were moving away from Egypt, God could have got them to the promised land in about a week and a half. But he said, they're not ready yet, because they're not ready for battle yet. So I'm going to take them another way. So he took them to a dead end. A dead end. No law was given yet. They hadn't had Torah. They didn't have any of that yet. This is all by faith. They came to the Red Sea. Pharaoh changed his mind, and the army started coming after him. And God had to put a shield of smoke between the army and them. And of course, you know what them people started doing? They were complaining every time something would happen. Oh, Moses just brought us here so we could be put to death and drowned in the sea and so forth. And Moses cried out to God, and God said, "Why are you crying out to me? Stick forth your rod. Take that rod you got there." And he did it, and by faith, it says right here, through faith, By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians are saying to do were drowned. So we see this work of faith in Moses' life. I mean, listen, things were happening to him that had never happened to anybody. He didn't have to go to school for 4 years to learn this stuff. He just had to believe in the Word of God. And he delivered his people. He didn't have the natural talent, the natural skills for it, but he was anointed by God to be the deliverer. And he believed God, and God honored his faith. Now, the very next verse doesn't say anything about coming through the wilderness, because a lot of things happened in that wilderness. A lot of things happened in the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. It was supposed to be just 2 years. Ended up being 40. Why? Because the people didn't believe. When they came to the edge of the Promised Land after 2 years, after they got now they had the law. They had Moses and the elders of Israel had supped with God. If you go to Exodus chapter 24, 25, and there is after the law was given and the covenant was struck, they actually fellowshiped with God. A blood-bought, blood-covered people were able to go and be in the presence. That lasted about 30 days until they made the golden calf. You know. But it says nothing about that here now. It goes right to the other side of Jordan. Moses is dead. And it doesn't even mention Joshua. But it says this in verse 30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. Again, God telling these people to do stuff that didn't make any sense in the world. You know, God ever tell you to do something stupid? Or something that just didn't make sense? Just something that... I'm so thankful, you know, Rosa testified. I never go, when she takes her treatments, I never go over there. You know, I mean, she's fine, and she comes, you know, she's done, she comes home. But something just said, well, you know, go over and, you know, maybe I should go and see Rose. And I was thinking, well, I could go home and watch TV. You know. I said, no, man, it was like, go over and see Rose. I mean, it's not stupid, you know, to go visit my wife. But, you know, I don't usually do that. When God gets you to do, how many have the testimony that you heard from God to do something you don't normally do, and you found out there was a blessing on the other end? If you can go to Joshua, the first couple chapters of Joshua, and God told Joshua what he had to do to walk around the city 7 times, and once a day for 7 days, and then 7 times, and blow the trumpets. And that's not, they don't teach you that in West Point. You know, that's not good tactics and strategy, you know. But that's what God said to do. And by faith, because they believed God, the walls of Jericho fell down. If that bunch that would have went in there, you know, 40 years earlier, and God would have told them to do that, they'd have gotten mad and went back to Egypt. That's what they wanted to do anyhow. So he had to wait till he had a people forged in the wilderness that would listen to him. And a leader that would listen to him. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. And listen, who else makes the list here in verse 31? By faith, the harlot, Rahab, who's not even a Jew. She's not even an Israelite. She's a Canaanite prostitute who lied. She lied to save the spies that went in. She had faith. She knew that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that had brought these people through the world, because they had heard about them, she knew that they had a God that was going to conquer that city. Even though by all intents and purposes the city was, you know, impenetrable. The walls, they had great walls around the city of Jericho, and they had a great army. But she knew, she believed in God. It says, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Not only was she not killed, she made the genealogy of Jesus. She's in the genealogy of Christ. She didn't know anything about the Torah. She didn't know anything about the law. She didn't know anything about keeping the Passover, Day of Atonement. She didn't know about the feast days. She didn't know about all the sacrifices and offerings and all that stuff. She just knew there was a God coming. It's just like that woman that came to Jesus, the Syrophoenician woman, and said, Jesus, my daughter's demon-possessed. Can you help her? By rights, she didn't deserve to come to him. He was the Jewish Messiah. But she got her miracle because she had faith. She didn't know anything about the law. She didn't know anything about keeping the Sabbath. She didn't know anything about the feast days. But she had faith, and she got her miracle. Look what else it says. He goes on and he says, and what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon. We all know about Gideon, right? These are names that we have heard. And of Barak from the book of Judges, of Samson and Jephthah, all from the book of Judges. Most of these people were like losers. But they believed God. They had faith in God. Samson, it took him a while to catch on. But he ended up killing more people in his death than he did in his life. Because he believed God. He called upon God. After they put his eyes out, he called upon the Lord one more time. They believed God. Gideon he was hiding. And God said, oh, Gideon, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon was like, me? Who, me? He was hiding. Jephthah was an outcast. Barak had to have Deborah go with him. He says, I'm not going unless you go with me. He had to have his girlfriend go with him. It wasn't his girlfriend. And he goes on and he says this, and who through faith, and he mentions David and Samuel and of the prophets, okay, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions through faith. It doesn't say one thing here about keeping any law. They just believe God. Do you believe God? Can we obtain promises? Can we have you ever wrought righteousness? Have you ever stopped the mouths of lions? Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to fight the armies of the aliens? Women received their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. Man, let's stop there. Not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. This is talking about Old Testament saints, but you can read the history of the martyrs in the last 2,000 years and read about people going through this stuff right now. They're doing it by faith. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these having obtained a good report through faith, received, they went through all this and they never saw in their earthly life the fulfillment of the promise. They might have seen some promises fulfilled, temporal promises, but they never saw Christ. Now, eventually they did. Eventually, after Jesus descended into paradise to lead them to the presence of the Father, they did. But in this lifetime, they never saw the fulfillment of the seed of the woman bruising the head of the seed of the serpent. They never saw that. But they believed in it. They looked forward to it. They had hope. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's what he began this chapter saying. And he ends up by saying that they received not the promise. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. He goes on and he says, I'm just going to read one verse from chapter 12 and we're going to close. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. The testimony of these ones, and we had mentioned the other day, John asked the question. He said, this is like, you're running a race in an arena and all these ones are up there. The people who are dead can't see what's going on here. They're not like, looking down and saying, hey, come on, man, you can do it. But their testimony, what we read about them, all these ones in the Old Testament, the ones from in the last 2,000 years and what's going on right now, we hear their testimony. We say that people endured things for Christ. They had faith. If they can have faith, can we have faith? He's writing this letter to Jewish Christians who were being persecuted by their own people. They were hated by the hierarchy. They were still, from all indications, when we read about Paul's visit to Jerusalem in the book of Acts, they still went to the temple, they still took vows, they still celebrated the holy days. That's what they knew. But that was all about to come to an end when the temple was destroyed, and many of them were shoved out of Jerusalem, never allowed to come back again. See, we have all these people that have gone before us. And the writer here is writing to these Hebrews, listen, it's not your religion that's going to save you. Because if I'm just holding on to religion, somebody points a gun in my head, man, I'll change my religion real quick. But if my eyes are on something that's beyond this life, just like theirs were, just like Moses, Abraham, Noah, all the people, Abel, Enoch, if we look beyond, if Jesus says, Paul says, we set our affection on things above and not things of this earth, then you'll have all the faith you need when it comes time to choosing to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season or suffer reproach with the people of God. You'll make the right choice if your eyes are on the right prize, if you're looking past. We'll pick up chapter 12 next week as we go on. Any questions or comments tonight?